I was watching 60 Minutes last Sunday evening. Maybe some of you watched it as well. And one of their segments was on the city of Kherson in the Ukraine, kind of the year anniversary after the Russian invasion. And it's a city that has been devastated by the war. There's very little food, only intermittent electricity, no coal or oil for heating, so it's been a very difficult winter. It's been very, very cold for the people there. And the reporter interviewed several people, interviewed a person who had been in the army, who had been tortured. But I was struck by the interview that she had with two elderly women. And one of the questions the reporter asked them was, why do you stay here? Why don't you leave and find refuge somewhere else? And one of the women replied something like, well, I'm 70-something years old. Where am I going to go? I can't start over. Now, I can't begin to understand or imagine all that those women endured. I'm sure there are people here today who can understand it, people who have had to have made that difficult choice to leave their country to find refuge. But I can understand, I think, in a certain sense, how difficult it would be to make such a decision to pick up everything and start over at an advanced age, even if it looked like everything was bad and didn't look like it was going to improve. So take a moment and imagine that. As I said, it might be easier for some to imagine it than others. And then look at our first reading, that very brief reading from the book of Genesis. Because Abram, at age 75, did exactly that. Right? Abram was called by the Lord to leave his native place, to pack up all his belongings, and go to a place that the Lord was going to show him. And he didn't even know what that place was. But despite the fact that he didn't know where it would end, Abram and Sarah set out on that because of his belief. And unlike those Ukrainian women, as far as we know, the country that Abram was in, was not at war. There was no deprivation for Sarah and himself. They weren't suffering from hunger. So we can just imagine that probably most of the people in his home country must have thought he was kind of crazy to be doing that. But still, he made that decision. And he made that decision because that external journey was really just a sign of an internal change that had already occurred in his life. And so that trust in God was going to allow him to travel by faith. The same trust in God that even though he and Sarah probably had been trying to conceive a child for perhaps 50 years without success, that same trust that they were going to become the parents of many nations. And so Abram and Sarah, in a sense, they traveled out beyond maybe what everybody else thought as common sense because of their faith, and followed the direction of the Lord. And in a similar way, in the gospel today, we see Jesus leading Peter and John and James on a similar journey of faith, right? So Jesus takes the three apostles on this grueling hike on a high mountain in order to pray with them. Now, the Christian tradition normally associates the mountain where Jesus was transfigured with Mount Tabor. I've never been to the Holy Land, but I've read that Mount Tabor towers over Galilee, the city of Galilee. And today it takes 10 or so minutes by vehicle to drive up to the top, going through the switchbacks, the zigzag roads. Now, of course, they didn't have cars in those days, but even today it takes vigorous climbers at least 2 hours to ascend to the top on foot. So the apostles, the disciples, needed to leave civilization and kind of their comfort zones behind and climb with Jesus, sweating, probably gasping for air. I know I would have been gasping for air, to pray with Jesus and to see him revealed. And I think a possible lesson for us, or at least a lesson for myself, is that the Lord likewise is asking for us to make an exertion this Lent. God is asking us to climb, to sweat, to work, to get out of breath. Obviously not climbing a mountain, but as we know, prayer and fasting and almsgiving, if we have set proper resolutions, they all require effort and sacrifice and perseverance. And the point of that effort, the point of that sacrifice, it's not to make us suffer, it's instead to help us to kind of reframe our priorities, to leave behind what people might call common sense, what we should be doing, and look at things from a different perspective. And on this Transfiguration Sunday, that different perspective is to see a little hint of the resurrection during this time of Lent. Right? So transfiguration, as we know, means transformed. So we have to ask, what is being transformed here? Well, certainly it is Jesus and his appearance. We read that in the gospel. His appearance is transformed before the disciples. But in another sense, Jesus is the same as he's always been. Now, we know that, Christians of today, because we have the benefit through all of Scripture of knowing what came before this part of the gospel and what comes after this scene. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard famously said, "Life is understood backward, but must be lived forward." Right? Or another way of saying it is, hindsight is 20/20. We know everything that's going to happen, right? But the disciples didn't. So what also is being transformed here is the disciples' understanding of Jesus, right? They know Jesus. They have been traveling with him. They know him as a teacher, a healer, a storyteller, probably a companion. And so all of that is very familiar to them, familiar and perhaps very safe, like they thought they knew him. But in today's gospel, they're getting a glimpse of who and what Jesus really is, and it amazes them. And we have to remember that this follows right after the verses in the preceding part of this gospel that Jesus has just given what is perhaps his most difficult and disturbing teaching of all, that he is going to suffer and die and rise again, and that anyone who wants to follow him likewise has to deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow him. So like the disciples, I think likewise we are called to transformation this Sunday, to see Jesus in perhaps a new and amazing way, maybe not the familiar way that we always think about him. The first Sunday of Lent always begins in the desert, where we get to have space with Jesus and we get to confront, if you will, our own temptations, our own fears. And the second Sunday of Lent is always Transfiguration Sunday, and it gives us this opportunity both to see Jesus in this new way and to see ourselves and the world in a new way. And like Peter, we're not called to build a tabernacle, we're not called to stay put, but to listen to Jesus and move on from that place. Right? That's God the Father's message there at the Transfiguration. Very powerful. Listen to him. Right? Listen to him, Christians. So what is going on? I ask the questions. Why are we still dividing the world according to skin color? Why are we still dividing the world according to a person's place of origin or their political beliefs? Why are we still putting money and economics before the needs of people? Why are we blaming the poor for their poverty? Why do we view the taking of human life as a solution to problems? All of these questions, and you probably have your own that you could ask. How do we listen to the Lord in the midst of these things that we encounter? I think it was Gandhi who said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." And so I ask myself these questions. Do I listen to him? Do I listen to Jesus? Are there things that I'm hearing? Are there things that I'm resisting? And when I'm honest, the answer is certainly yes. There are things that give me solace, things that give me comfort that I'm afraid to leave behind. But like Abram, I'm called to overcome that fear and to make that change and to set out in faith. So I think Lent is a time to ask ourselves those kinds of questions. What do I want to change in myself? What do I want to change in the world? And what is powerful enough to bring about that transformation in myself, in the church, and in the world? And I think, just briefly, the answer is turning to the words of St. Augustine: love God first, and then love everybody else and everything else for the sake of God. So love God first. In Lent, we learn to give the right time to prayer, to fasting, to almsgiving, both personal and this community sense, which strengthens our spiritual life. And so that prayer, it doesn't isolate us from the world. It doesn't isolate us from the community, as maybe Peter wanted to do, stay on that mountain. Rather, I think prayer leads us back to the journey and into action. And that, I think, is the message of this Transfiguration Sunday. It means continuously climbing the mountain to meet God, and then to come back down, bearing love and strength from God so as to serve our brothers and sisters in our community.